Hi, I'm Kenny. When your application is refused and you received a refusal letter like this, you totally have no idea why the visa officer refused your application from this. Do you? Then what's your first thought? You must wonder if there is a way for you to know the specific reasons why the visa officer refused your application. The answer is yes. You can retrieve the visa officer's notes of determining your application through an ATIP request. In this video, I'll introduce what is an ATIP request, what's it used for, and what you need to know about it. Now let's start. The ATIP request is indeed made up of two different types of requests. The first one is access to privacy request under the Privacy Act. I call it ATP request. It's based on the Law of Privacy Act. The Privacy Act protects the privacy of individuals with respect to personal information about themselves held by a government institution. This act also provides Canadian citizens, permanent residents, and foreign nationals, regardless of where they are located, the right to access and request correction to their own personal information. So the ATP request can not only be used to access your own information, but also to correct them if there is a mistake with your information. In Canada immigration field, the ATP request is used to retrieve your own complete application package, including the application forms and all the supporting documents. This is very useful if you want to check the application package after it was submitted, or you just want to save it for record for any reasons. Particularly, for example, long time ago, you applied for a Canada visit visa. Although you got an approval, you lost all the record of your application package. Now you are gonna apply for a second study permit or work permit or even permanent residence. You want to make sure that you are providing exactly the same information as the application forms in your visit visa application, so that there won't be any discrepancy in your information between different applications, to avoid the possibility of misrepresentation or even just an extra delay in the processing of your application. And there are some cases nobody wants to see. For example, you hired a representative, mostly unauthorized practitioner, or ghost agent. Unlike VRCIC, for whatever reasons, they didn't provide you the application package after it was submitted, or even refused. You can certainly obtain the application package from the IRCC through this ATP request. Here are some notes you need to know about the ATP request. Firstly, you can make a request for free. The government doesn't charge you anything for this service. Secondly, anyone from anywhere can apply. You don't have to be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident to make such a request. And certainly, when you don't know how to make it or you just don't know how to fill the form, you can always use a representative. The representative doesn't need to be a lawyer or a RCIC. There are quite a few people providing this service for a fee, and I'll put a link down the video in case you need it. Thirdly, you can submit your request either online or by mail. When you submitted the request online, in many cases in 2024, it mostly takes about 1 month, and occasionally it can take up to 3 months or even more. And please note, in some cases, when you submit your request and wait for a period, instead of your application package, you receive a reply from the IRCC saying that your application record is not available anymore. For some reasons, the IRCC isn't saving your record, or it was just lost. It might sound like bad news, but actually it can be good news as well. Because in that case, the IRCC doesn't have a copy of your old application. This can save you trouble of comparing your new application and your old application. In some extreme cases, the ATP request can be very useful. For example, I once heard about a case. For some reasons, the applicant suspected his representative submitted an application of misrepresentation to the IRCC, so he acquired a copy of the submitted application and found several information were not true. So he just contacted the IRCC, explaining about everything, and submitted a new application package with true information. His application was finally successfully approved. So you see, knowing this trick can be very much helpful in some cases. The second type of request is Access to Information request under the Access to Information Act. I'll just call it ATI request. The nature of the ATI request is that the Access to Information Act gives Canadian citizens, permanent residents, and individuals or corporations present in Canada the right to access records under the control of a federal government institution in accordance with the principles that government information should be available to the public, that necessary exceptions to the right of access should be limited and specific, and that decisions on the disclosure of government information should be reviewed independently of government. In Canada immigration field, an ATI request is most often used to obtain the visa officer's notes of a refusal or to check the current application status. Let me show you what a refusal notice looks like. A typical notice normally have at least a dozen of pages, among which only one page or two bear the refusal reasons. As you can see in this one, it's very simple. I have reviewed the application. I have considered the following factors in my decision. The applicant's assets and financial situation are insufficient to support the stated purpose of travel for the applicant. The purposes of the applicant's visit to Canada is not consistent with a temporary stay given the details provided in the application. Weighing the factors in this application, I am not satisfied that the applicant will depart Canada at the end of the authorized stay. For the reasons above, I have refused the application. So all the information here are just the visa officer's conclusion. But how the visa officer reached this conclusion? For example, why the applicant's assets and financial situation are insufficient, and why the purpose of the applicant's visit to Canada is not consistent. It doesn't say. So as you see, the visa officer's notes is not very informative and not very useful in many cases. This is probably because nowadays the IRCC requires all the visa officers to use templates to produce the refusal notes to avoid public criticism caused by some creative notes. However, in another case, this kind of notes can be very much useful. When you submitted your application and waited for a super long time, your application is probably pending an admissibility check. Then you can submit an ATI request. And how you read the notes and confirm that your application is pending admissibility check. Let me show you. When you received your visa notes, firstly, you look for the section named Assessments, just like this one. Normally, it's located on the second page. When it is followed by Eligibility Passed, this means the eligibility assessment of your application is completed and you succeeded. Then we continue looking at the notes. Now you look for the section named Admissibilities, and when you see the security is marked with a 1, that means positive. This section is applying on your application. For example, when you see a 0, this means negative. This part is not applicable on your application. Now you know your application is probably under security check. And when you see the very next following page has a big blank, this is because some information is hidden. Like I mentioned before, there can be some necessary exceptions to the right of access. And because the security check is relevant to the national security and therefore is sensitive information, so it's removed before the note is released to the applicant. This notes perfectly confirmed that the application is under a security check 100%. And in the case your application is still in the processing or is already approved, normally you cannot see any information material in the notes. So far, to my best knowledge, this ATI request is the only 100% correct way to check the status of your application when it's under admissibility check. Other alternatives, including the application status tracker, isn't that much useful. In fact, it's often out of date. For example, almost for the entire second half of 2024, the tracker is frozen, and all of my applications don't have any update. During that 6 months, it made me think the tracker system was abandoned by the government. The good news is, it seems it's coming back. By the end of 2024, those applications got updated long after they had been decided. However, in the application status tracker, background verification in progress doesn't necessarily mean your application is under a material admissibility check, because it shows that way for every single application. And when it says eligibility completed, it doesn't mean your application passed the eligibility check as well. Surely you can still refer to that tracker. It's just you need to know that it's not that precise in many cases. Some people may also have heard about another way to know if your application is under admissibility check. That is by looking at the back-end code of the application system web page introduced by some social media. However, according to my experience, it is totally wrong. It might have worked for one case or two at a time, but the application system keeps updating, upgrading, and even changing its structure and code. Therefore, there isn't a necessary connection between the status of your application and the code at all. Similarly, here is something you need to know about the ATI request. First of all, it would cost you $5 Canadian to make a request. Secondly, as I mentioned, to submit an ATI request, you need to be a Canadian citizen, a permanent resident, or an individual, or a corporation currently in Canada. So if you are a foreign national residing in a foreign country, you have to use a representative. And again, this representative does not have to be a lawyer or an RCIC. So I'll put a link downside the video in case you need help. Just like the ATP request, you can either apply online or by mail. And the waiting time in 2024 was mostly about 1 month. And in some cases, it can take up to 3 months or even more. What's interesting is, there was one case that after I submitted the ATI request on behalf of my client, I never received a reply from the LCC. But because the application was finally approved after it was initially refused, the client didn't care about the notes anymore. So I just let it be. Here I'd like to make a call to everyone. Don't make such ATIP requests too often. For example, I have heard someone just made the ATI request every other week because he is very eager to receive the notes. But listen, that wouldn't help, and right on the contrary, that kind of behavior would bring extra burden on the IRCC, so that everyone has to wait much longer, including yourself. So please be patient once you submit the request. If you have any questions about this ATIP request, please do let me know. I'm Kenny. Learn my lessons on your way to Canada. See you in next video.